and she's made this very clear in her whole academic career, all her writing. It's all about monetary policy should be helping jobs in the street. I mean, she's a really strong believer in this, and she absolutely will never live with herself if she risks hiking parental leave. She's made this very clear. Now, some people counter with Yellen doesn't have full control of the committee, and she may, while she's the most important member, she doesn't. It's not a dictatorship, and that's a fair point. But I think she is definitely influencing things a lot. So to me, they're always going to hike much later. They've made clear they're going to hike much later than the market wants, despite their dots, which I think has caused some confusion. So if they do hike this year, I think they'll only hike and make very clear there's not a second one coming for a long time. But personally, I don't even think they're going to hike this year. I don't see the logic for it. The whole world's fighting with a deflation issue, not an inflation issue. And this is brilliant for the US because they're able to unwind their QE without, they didn't get forced to unwind QE when they were already getting hyperinflation. I think this subpar growth is perfectly fine for the US. Every year, I don't know, I've never said this exactly, but I think something of the last 6 years, US growth is massively disappointed every year. Every year they're going to say, this year US growth is going to be 3.5%, whatever. And every year it disappoints and gets revised down, and it's been disappointing. I think maybe the one exception is 2012 got revised back up a little bit. But the point is that growth in the US is probably going to be 2.5% or something. It's not exciting. I don't know.
Yeah, I disagree.
Okay, it's good.
I mean, and I know I'm in my minority camp in a big way on this. In fact, I did a blog a couple of weeks ago saying the 5 reasons why the Fed might hike in June, because you have to have 5 reasons for everything these days, it seems, right? And I know June is highly, highly unlikely now, but I think if you read between the lines, the Fed is fairly keen to get off the zero lower bound. And so, yeah, that doesn't imply, rapid, string of rate hikes by any stretch of the imagination. I think, in fact, and so away from the economics, just on the pure operational side of things, they have this new floor in place with their overnight reverse repo facility, which they're still debating, which is hard to believe, right? They're still debating how big it should be, what should be the safety guards around it, so it doesn't add fuel to a crisis that everyone wants to rush to the Fed to get stash their money. But they have this new corridor between interest on excess reserves and this the overnight repo, and I think you can't really properly test it when you're stuck at the zero lower bound as they are right now, doing all this testing they've done at 5, 7, 10 basis points. So I think that, there's very active discussions ongoing about that, and I guess there's still even discussion about well, do we wind down some of our QE at the same time as this? So the important thing is the mechanics are really important. I think they do want to get off the zero lower bound. I mean, inflation is actually not really that bad in the U.S. Not just cherry pick numbers, but I think it's safe to take energy out of the equation because we do drive a lot, And if you look at some of the trim mean inflation gauges, from the regional feds, they're all around 1.6 to 1.8%. So it's not a deflationary scenario in the U.S. like it looks here or in Europe or other places. And then the economy too is we've had disappointing jobs number in March, but we came off a period where the 3-month average of private payrolls had even overtaken the peaks seen in the last cycle, right? So you have to keep in mind, the Fed said this too, Dudley and Yellen. I mean, there's been a lot of cumulative progress, right? So we're not in 2011 with the stuttering economy anymore, or 2012. It's 2015, and we've had basically the longest streak of job gains on record. And you're starting to see some. It's not in the main wage gauges yet, really, but if you look at unemployment rate for college graduates over 25, it's 2.5%, right? I mean, is that going to go to 0? There's only so much the Fed can do to help unskilled workers, right? And job vacancies are massive. They're absolutely, they're near record highs right now, right?
Just 2 questions. As I said, I think the job market has done well, and they originally said to point to that in the recent dip down was a one-off from the non-farm payrolls. The average is still well above 200k for the last 6 months. But two things, like, if I agree with you, in theory they want to get off the lower bound. I completely agree with you in that kind. My problem is they've now tried to turn everyone to say, look at the data, we're not going to pre-commit, we're going to do less guidance, look at the data. And I don't think the data is going to, they're going to have enough strong data points to justify moving and giving that signal by June. So that's why I don't think June. Now, even whether you disagree or agree on that, but I'm interested to know whether you think they're going to have enough data points by then to actually definitely do it by June. But even if they do hike this year, how do you feel about the idea that they might hike once, but say very clear, look, we're doing this because we want to get off zero bound, we want to start normalising the system, but absolutely, we're going to be uber patient for a long time to come.
Yeah, I don't know how they're going to phrase it, but I think absolutely that's what they'll do.
Okay.
So I think, it's going to be a much lower terminal rate than ever before, right? How they get there will be uneven. I'm surprised how many people in the market still think that once they start, they can't pause and stop. And it's like, of course they will. There's no reason why this is going to be a normal rate hike cycle, right? So, I mean, part of the argument for June is actually that they'll pause and wait, 2 meetings or so, because again, operationally, they've got to make this new corridor work for them, right? And that's going to take time to figure out. I mean, I really don't think December makes sense, because are you going to wait until year end and all the fun money market pressures that happen at year end to suddenly lift rates and make this new floor happen? I mean, that's just kind of insane.
No, I agree, and for that argument I can accept them maybe doing September. But I think if they do September, they're going to go. The next one won't be till like at least mid next year. Then I think it'll be like, look, we're doing one now because we want to start normalising the system at the lower bound, but not because we actually want to start a rate hiking cycle.
Yeah, no, I mean, I could see that happening, and it really just depends on the labor market and wages, right? But with the last disappointing, number, we had private payrolls 3-month average dip to 188,000. That had been up around 220, 230. So if we get a number back around there or above in April, May, June is not impossible, but I think you'd have to see a pretty strong bounce back. And and I think, Douglas made it actually very clear in his last speech. He said, we want to see consumption go back to the levels that we saw in Q3, Q4 before Q1. So, I mean, he was very explicit. So, away from the labor market even, just looking at PCE consumption, if it starts to go back to that, pre-Q1 trend, then I think, and the jobs, numbers reflect what it was towards the end of last year, then I think they'll be more comfortable about going. But I think they've also, they drop patient for a reason. I just be calling it maximum flexibility, right? They really want to give themselves as much wiggle room as possible, which is why I think they're still keeping June in play, even if it's less likely.
Well, I guess on Jeremy's side, do you think the Fed are going to be patient, as Mark suggests, or do you think they'll pull the trigger a bit earlier?
I'll probably sit somewhere in between.
Okay.
I think that the idea that I don't want them to miss the window to normalise rates, because maybe I look at it from too much of theory and economics, being at uni and stuff. Yeah. But if they can't manage to get off the zero lower bound, and then the next crisis comes from wherever, in 3 or 4 years' time, then how are they going to be able to respond to that? So I do definitely think that they're going to want to get off that floor as soon as they really can, and obviously that's data dependent, but I think looking at most of the data, I think that's justifiable to have a hike, probably not in June, even though I think it could be argued, and you do argue it, but probably September. I think from there, a much lower sort of terminal rate, but then you look at what the market expects, it's somewhere around 2% as a terminal rate, which is much lower than the past. I think if you were to look at the same sort of key variables 10, 15 years ago, most people would say, we should be due a hike if inflation's okay-ish at around sort of 1.5%. Unemployment's dropping quite fast. Growth is okay. Today's print wasn't very good, but generally speaking, we could be at around 2.5% each year, and we have been for a few years. Then, in the past, that would have been good enough for.
I actually disagree. I think in the past there was inflation at 1.5%. I mean, pre-crisis, that would have been, we better cut. We've got to stimulate inflation. Only 1.5%.
Yeah, but compared to the rest
the world's
of the world,
collapsing. Would have been.
We were saying earlier that in the G10, I mean.
No, but I'm just saying that like pre-Lehman, pre-crisis, like this is a whole new world. Like inflation at 1.5% was like, oh my god, the world's going into a bad place kind of thing. I know it sounds bizarre, but like.
Yeah. But I mean, in the situation that we are in now, where what were we saying? Sort of the middle of the G10 is at what 0.8% or so.
Yeah, something.
So relative to a lot of these, and I mean New Zealand right at the bottom of the sort of G10 inflation, they've had a hiking cycle, which I think they'll probably end up reversing, or at least I think they probably will end up reversing that. But I do think that there's enough evidence and enough data to support a hike this year. But yeah.
I think one important thing that's hasn't gotten too much attention, and is, and both Dudley and Yellen have mentioned it, is financial conditions. So they've almost, the Fed is cognizant that its very steady hike cycle, back in, what was it, 2004 to 2007, well, there still was a massive housing asset bubble that happened on their watch, right? So they've, even though it's not officially part of their mandate, they've made pretty clear they're going to take financial conditions into consideration. So, if they start and there's a taper tantrum, I don't know what we call, lift-off tantrum, whatever it is, then that would be a reason to pause and wait, right? So I don't know how exactly they're going to do it. Obviously, they're really thinking about 10-year yields and interest rates when they're talking about financial conditions. But they are very cognizant that they screwed up last time around and don't want there to be asset bubbles happening while they're trying to get going. Well,
you don't think there are no asset bubbles out there, honest?